Before we begin our lesson in Joshua this morning, would you all bow with me as we offer a word of prayer? Our gracious Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for the morning that you have given us and for the opportunity we have now to spend time in the word that you have so graciously, mercifully preserved for us so that we may learn how to be strong and of good courage. And as we think of our lesson this morning, we are reminded of the words of the hymn, "Christian, do you see them?" And we are reminded how temptations are on every side, reminded of how even in your very good garden there was temptation. And so, Father, grant us the strength, the resolve to look away from Satan's Babylonian garment, to not to be allured by his wedge of gold, but rather to value the true milk and honey that Jesus offers. Please be with Stephen and everyone else who is standing before students this morning teaching your word, and grant all of us understanding as we look into your word this morning, and furthermore resolution to do right by the things that you teach us. In the name of Jesus, do we offer you thanks and give you praise for this day. Amen.
Let's open up to Joshua chapter 7. We'll be picking up there this morning, Joshua chapter 7. We'll be looking at these next couple of chapters here and the sort of fallout of the conquering of Jericho. And before we do that, I just want to make some clarification in talking about the manna and the produce of the land. So the manna, I talked about that being God's provision. And then, of course, in chapter 5, that manna ceases and they begin to take of the produce. And I was talking about our dependence on God. There's a sense in which we are always dependent on God, but it's not a lazy dependence. It's not a passive dependence. In fact, so when we pray, give us this day our daily bread, what we are praying is for God to do all of the things that really are impossible. You can't make the sunshine or the rain come or the seeds germinate or all the things necessary to bring about the daily bread. But when you pray that, it doesn't mean you stay home and wait for it to fall in your lap. So God's provision of the manna was a provision of what Israel could not provide for themselves until such time as they could provide it. But it also did teach them God is your provider. And when they go into the land and they eat of the produce, God is providing, right? So that notion doesn't leave, even though their interaction with that blessing changes as they enter the land. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I don't want it to be like we should have an independence from God. We always have dependence on God, but the nature of that may change from one instance to the next. Well, we talked about the taking of Jericho, and the final verse there of chapter 7 says, "So Yahweh was with Joshua, and the report about him was in all the land." Chapter 7 picks up with the negative conjunction, but the sons of Israel acted unfaithfully in regard to the things devoted to destruction. This is part of what we're going to get into in the lesson, as it introduces this section, not saying a son of Israel, but the sons of Israel were unfaithful. What is this referring to? Is the sin of Achan? What was the sin of Achan? All right, so as we go back to chapter 6, we see that it was explicitly instructed that in the city of Jericho, they were to take none of the spoils, right? All of that was to be devoted to God. And the word devoted there is associated either with giving completely to God or in many cases destroyed for God's purpose. It's almost like sacrifice to God. In fact, very often that's what it means, burned up sacrifice to God. So these things were under that sort of devotion to God, and someone has taken them, that is Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah. And I will just say that right off the bat, we want to keep in mind the way Achan is described here. Generation upon generation upon generation. And so there's an extensiveness to which it's not just this guy identified as the son of this guy. No, it's giving you his whole line. And I think that generational aspect becomes important a little bit later as we talk about what the punishment for all of this is. So what are the consequences for this sin?
A little town beats them.
Pardon?
A little town beats them.
All right, a little town beats them. And we'll see about the nature of that town in just a minute, the size of that town. But they go up to Ai, and they are defeated at Ai. And then what? Continued consequences. What other consequences are there?
Achan and his family are killed.
All right, Achan and his family are identified. Achan is identified as the one who took the things under the ban. And then he and his family are stoned and then burned, and then a monument is made to this judgment that would be seen by later generations. And so we see that play out in the second half of the chapter, beginning in verse 16. So as you're looking at what all's happening here, let's first of all make some notes with regards to the geography of what we're looking at here. This is our map of the territory during, this would be, it's already laid out for us, the territories that are going to be described a little bit later in the book of Joshua. But we've already talked about Jericho, which is right here. They came over into Gilgal, just a few miles away. They took Jericho. And then Ai, that they would go and try to take, and then eventually take in chapter 8 next, is right here. So it looks fairly straightforward from Gilgal to Jericho and Ai, but of course this map is two-dimensional, which leaves out some pretty important aspects of the lay of the land. This map at least gives us a description of the various portions of the land. So beginning there on the western side, over by the Mediterranean Sea, we have what's called a coastal plain. So coming out from the sea, it's fairly flat, plain territory, coming all the way over into the mountains. In chapter 2, in number 2, Roman numeral 2 there, you go up into hill country, and really all of these run north to south, you can see, right? It's lengthy territory running north to south. So there's plains run north to south, and you move up into the hill country. Jerusalem, of course, would be in the hill country. It's on a mountaintop. And a lot of these cities are going to be on mountaintops. And mountaintops would be particularly important for what reasons? Yeah, they're militarily advantageous places, right? And so we don't, in our current society, generally think primarily in terms of like defensible city locations. But of course, they would have thought in terms of that. Well, then you come down into what's called the Jordan Valley. That's coming down from the mountain all the way down to the Jordan River. And so what you can see here is Jericho is right down in that Jordan Valley. Ai, and this is approximate for a couple of reasons. First of all, it wasn't on this map, so I kind of just plopped it down there as best we could. Second of all, we don't know because we're not absolutely certain where Ai was. We have pretty good ideas because it does give us some locations near Beth Aven, so we've got some ideas. There's a couple of different options that people say, maybe here, but in this general vicinity, it's certainly up in the hill country. So even though Ai is not much farther in a straight line from Jericho than Gilgal was, it is very far up. So the Jordan Valley, the Dead Sea, lowest place on earth, right? I think it has it on here, what does that say? 1,292 feet below sea level. And so it is a deep, deep valley. And even Jericho, which is not as deep as the Dead Sea, is still, I think, some 800 feet below sea level. When you go up into the hill country, you're looking at, I think Ai is around 2,800 feet above sea level. So you're talking about 3,600 feet in a relatively short amount of time, a short distance there that they would be climbing up. So this is not just coming straight across. This is them going up into the hill country. Now, Jericho, just another geographical note, Jericho has 3 roads at this time leading out of it. One to the south, one to the north, and one into the central territory. The one to the south goes to Jerusalem. The one to the north, I can't remember the name of the city. It's not one that we're familiar with. It went into another city to the north. And then the one going to the center into Ai. It looks like Ai is probably the least defended among those. But I would also add, from a military standpoint, going through the center first divides the land up into north and south, as opposed to if you start at one end and come on down, then the forces gather as you go. But if you cut in the middle, then they can't, band together because now you've taken the middle territory. So I think that's interesting to note and a likely reason why they would have gone through the center first. So that gives you a little bit of the geography as we're getting here into this particular story. All right, now looking at what happens here before we get into the reaction of Joshua. Joshua tells them to do what? At the beginning. All right, we're spying out the land again, right? So far, we've already had that in the case of Jericho, go spy out. Now, again, go spy out. And this time, what do the spies say?
Well, I think it's important to remember what they had just done and the Lord's deliverance of Jericho to them. So they said, no big deal, let's just take 2,000 or 3,000. We can knock that out Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, there you go. All right, yeah. So it's 2,000 or 3,000, and particularly what does the spies say as far as why leave everybody else home? Not just because it's not a big force, but what else? Yeah, weary. We don't want to make everybody tired because they're so exhausted from the taking of Jericho, which required so much effort on their part, right? There does seem to be a tone. And especially when you compare it to what they said when they came back from spying out Jericho. What all did they say when they came back from Jericho? They don't say easy pickings, necessarily.
It's a fortified city, it's all shut up.
They say, the Lord has given them into our hands. They don't say that here. They just say, we can do this, easy peasy. And I do think that's important as we continue on and we are wondering, why is God so upset? I think this may play into that. There is a distinction between the nature, the attitude of the spies coming out of Jericho, at least it seems, and the attitude of the spies coming back from Ai, saying we would only need 2,000 or 3,000. Now, if God had said you only need 2,000 or 3,000, great. I mean, if he said you'd need 2, that's fine. But I don't know that he said that. In fact, I think the implication is he didn't, especially as we continue to go on. So they go up with their 3,000. They did at least err on the side of the larger number of the 2,000 or 3,000. And one commentator said that this could be translated as 3 companies. Which I think may be significant in the number that was destroyed. How many were killed in this raid? 36 men, which if they took 3 companies would divide up into how many per company? 12. That may be significant as they're going up with their 3 companies. 12 from each company are destroyed. That would maybe communicate something about the nature of that not being just not just being simple, we just didn't have it today, but rather we lost a number of men, that maybe puts a point on the loss. So they come back, and of course, they report the loss to Joshua. And what is Joshua's response? What's his reaction?
Tore his clothes and fell on his face before the ark of the Lord.
All right, he tore his clothes, fell on his face. They put dust on their heads, and then he cries out to God. And what is the nature of his cry? What all does he say to God?
First of all, I'm not sure whether to think that this is to his credit or not. But he resorts to something like the argument that the Israelites themselves made in the first generation. Why'd you even bring us over here just to let us be destroyed? But to his credit, he goes on to say, what's this going to mean for your great name? Yeah. So he does appeal to God on behalf of the glory that will be brought, or the shame that would be brought to his name if they are defeated.
Okay. Yeah, so his argument does sound like the argument of the Israelites after Numbers 13 and 14, or during Numbers 13 and 14 when the spies come and persuade them not to go in. Why even bring us out here? It's not just there. In fact, it's again in Numbers chapter 20, right, when they're wanting water. You know, why did you bring us out here? But his argument concludes more like Moses' argument in Exodus 32 and other places, including Numbers 14, which is to say, if this people is destroyed, what will Egyptians say? What will other nations say about the great God of Israel? And so, as Brad says, I'm not sure if it's to his credit. I do think the conclusion there means it is to his credit, right? He ends up where Moses ends up. What other similarities, in addition to that sort of conclusion, do you see between this reaction and the reactions of Moses?
There is a certain intercessory nature to it. So Joshua is coming to God on behalf of people.
Yeah, and so he's a mediator, much the same way Moses has been a mediator. There's some similarities in the very physical action. So, for instance, in Numbers chapter 14 and verse 5, Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before the Lord, and so the action is the same. And in fact, in verse 6, Joshua and so you have Moses and Aaron falling on their faces in verse 5 of Numbers 14. Verse 6, Joshua and Caleb tear their clothes. So you've got sort of a combination of the action of Moses and Aaron and Joshua and Caleb all being acted out here by Joshua as he falls on his face before God. And so I do think there's some overlapping ideas there. All right, so he pleads with God, and God's response, his immediate sort of answer is what to Joshua? Get up. Get up. And it's interesting. One of the things Joshua says is he uses this language, we cannot stand before, and it's really the same word, rise up in the face of our enemies. God tells Joshua, rise up, right? We cannot stand, and God says, stand up. But not stand up and go to war, stand up and take care of this, right? We're going to consecrate, we're going to rid Israel of the sin that is hindering them. And he goes on to give Joshua the instructions about how to find where that sin lies, and then what the judgment will be. And so, beginning in verse 16, what we see is Joshua going right through that and going through the ceremony, if you will. And it is a ceremony, right? Let me ask this, like with God's aid, does Joshua, if God decides, does Joshua need this ceremony to get to the guilty party? No. This is for everybody's sake. A production is being made, isn't it? Right? This is very demonstrable, right? And let's go down through until we come to the family, and then the family is going to be brought out. We do get a fairly lengthy discourse from Achan as he confesses his sin, and he confesses where he hid the items that were under the ban. And then, of course, we get the punishment. We'll come to that in just a moment. But let's back up here for just a minute. What about the whole nation suffering? The whole nation suffers the shame and defeat because of the sin of one man. Where's the justification in that? Except, of course, God did it. But other than that.
Covenant is with the nation to take the nation. It's an all-encompassing fight. It's not just the individual effort under this particular case. And they're to be held accountable for sin being present, which would cause God to leave their presence.
Right.
Be holy for I am.
Yes, yeah. So God has been very explicit in rooting out in the consecration and the purity of his people. Tony?
Well, along the same line, verse 1, as we started out, the children of Israel committed a trespass. Verse 11, Israel has sinned. In verse 12, the consequences, therefore, the children of Israel could not stand. So they stand or fall together.
Okay, I think that is correct. But Chris?
I was just going to say in 6:18, God had told them that if you took the cursed things, it makes the camp of Israel cursed, and it will trouble it.
Okay.
So he directly said,
Right. That's the first thing I want to say. God had already said, if anybody takes it, the whole camp will suffer. Now, if you were in a group of people and you were told, if anybody does this thing, everybody will suffer, what would you do?
Sure that the steps were made to make sure that everybody did what God said.
You better believe it. So I do think when it says the sons of Israel had sinned, that they had not taken all the precautions that they ought to have to make sure this does not happen. I think sometimes we look at it and we're just reading through and we just say, well, look, I mean, they all had to suffer. But God told them this is what would happen, right? And the idea is that you would self-police. Right, I've been in classrooms like that or with coaches like that like, if anybody does this, these are going to be the consequences. What do? You start looking around and say, hey, look, everybody get on board, right? We're not going to all suffer because one person. And so we make sure that nobody lags behind, that nobody does this sort of thing. So I think that's one thing, that they didn't take those precautions. Brad?
I think, too, it's painting a picture for us. You said it, others have said it. You don't know what all the consequences of sin are.
Yes.
And this is to say, it's more than just Achan who suffers. It's more than just you. When you think this is a private sin, nobody will ever know. No, it will spread, and you may not know the consequences for years.
Yes, which goes to, I think, the connection God makes in Leviticus between sin and, let us say, communicable diseases. That you're supposed to think about it like that these are contagions, and that we ought to be careful and thoughtful about how to handle that and to root that out, as it were. Jacob.
I think we see some of the same things in Numbers 25 when people are committing harlotry with the daughters of Moab, and then who is killed first? It's the elders of the people that are executed because they failed in their responsibility. And then you see Phinehas praised because he takes responsibility for the people and tries to put them in.
Right. Make sure that he will not be a part. All right. So that's one aspect is the responsibility to be a watchman, the responsibility to understand what the consequences are and take action to make sure that doesn't come. Kevin?
I've always been impressed with how complete and thorough Achan's confession is. Yeah, I did this, and I did this, and I did this, and that's where they are. He doesn't sound like a man who is expecting to die. I would expect a lot more pleading and a lot more concealing if I was about to die. It makes me think that, yeah, we may be punished, but it's not going to be that bad.
Yeah, that's one possibility. I will suggest another in just a moment when we get to Achan's punishment. So I would add to that the nature, and we're given this whole interaction of sending in the spies. We're given what the words of their report. I would add to that the nature of their going and spying out, and the nature of how they contemplate going leaves out God. If they had inquired of God, what do you think they might have found? Yeah, don't go. There's sin in the camp. You're going to want to take care of that before you go. So I think there's a second failure right there. And we'll see this is not the last time they fail to consult God. And so I think there's at least two fairly stark possibilities for Israel to have found a way to avoid this that they did not. And so, as we take the narrator's words as the inspired words, Israel acted unfaithfully. Israel sinned in regards to this. That they did in some way participate. And so don't just come away with, there's no way they could have known, there's nothing that they could have done, it doesn't matter, they'll still suffer. I don't know about that. And I think there are several instances where we see God does distinguish the individual from the people around him and from the nation around him and punishes that person. In fact, in Deuteronomy 29, it talks about if somebody goes off and does this, I will bring punishment on that man, right? But it also says if someone comes to you and says, let us go worship idols, what do? You stone them, right? You don't just say, man, I wouldn't do that. No, you say, we will not have it. We will not have it. I would also just bring into this discussion 2 Samuel chapter 24. In 2 Samuel, you remember David's census of the people. This is another instance where it seems like the nation suffers because of the sin of one man, right? But what does it tell us at the beginning of that story in 2 Samuel 24 and verse 1? Well, before that, before it even starts down the path, it tells us why all of this is happening.
God's anger burned against Israel.
God was already angry with Israel. David's census became an opportunity for God to bring judgment on Israel that for some reason he already wanted to bring. Right? It doesn't say David made the census and then God's anger burned. It says his anger burned and then of course in the Chronicles account it says Satan provoked David to do this. But God used this opportunity through David's negligence and arrogance, but to bring judgment on a people who also were culpable and also were already guilty. So it's not like you have David over here doing something and the people they're so innocently standing by and they couldn't help it. I mean, their king is doing this. No, it's put into the context of the people are already under God's wrath. And so I think when we see instances of a whole nation suffering because of one man, usually you'll find that the nation has their own culpabilities involved as well. And I think that's probably the case here. I think there's plenty of indicators to suggest that. Well, then coming down to Achan himself. So he comes to Achan, as I said, through this ceremonial process that was instructed by God. Joshua said to Achan, my son, I implore you, give glory to Yahweh, the God of Israel, and give praise to him, and declare to me now what you have done. Do not hide it from me. Achan answered and said, truly, I have sinned against Yahweh, the God of Israel, and this is what I did. I saw among the spoil a beautiful mantle from Shinar and 200 shekels of silver. Can you think of anybody else who saw something beautiful, saw that something was beautiful? Yeah, Genesis 3. This is the same language of Genesis 3. I saw what was beautiful. And so I took the mantle, the 100 shekels of silver, a bar of gold, 50 shekels in weight, coveted them. This is the same word as covet in the Ten Commandments, and took them. And behold, they are concealed in the earth inside my tent with the silver underneath it. So Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent. Behold, it was concealed in his tent with silver underneath it. And then they took them from inside the tent and brought them to Joshua and all the sons of Israel, and they poured them out before Yahweh. Joshua and all Israel took Achan the son of Zerah, the silver, the mantle, the bar of gold, his sons, his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all that belonged to him. And they brought them to the valley of Achor. All right. So what was to be done, as a reminder, what was to be done with all the spoil from Jericho?
Supposed to be left.
Destroyed or devoted to God. When Achan takes that into his house, then what happens to him is the same thing that happens to the spoil. You see that? That he suffers the punishment of taking, he suffers the same punishment, right? This is going to be destroyed. Are you going to be destroyed with it? And so I think about that from the standpoint of our attachment to the world. Here's a world that's going to be destroyed. Are you going to be destroyed with it? You take it in, and you will suffer the same consequences of those things. And so it's a very connected punishment, right? It's not a, well, you did this, and then here's this. It's same thing. Now, as regards to Achan's family, what's the justification here in stoning and burning all of Achan's family?
I have seen an explanation offered, admittedly a possible explanation, that Achan may have had help he enlisted his family in keeping the secret. You certainly cannot make that argument definitively.
Yep.
So my suspicion is that we're going back to the second commandment now, visit the iniquities of the fathers upon the children of the third and fourth generation. When you do something like this, that you are the head of your household, and it's not just you who are cursed, you bring a curse upon your entire household, and they have to suffer for it as well.
Right. All right. So the consequences flow downward. I also saw several suggestions, including Joshua told the people to consecrate themselves, and there's some idea that consecrate would be examine yourselves, and that his family would have been a part of that, and why couldn't they find it, right? I lean more in the direction of the phrase, everything that belonged to him. That includes his family. And I would add to this what we said at the beginning. His whole genealogy is brought in. Where does that genealogy stop? Right here. Right? So as you get that whole genealogy, it's to say, all the way from Judah down to Achan, done. That's what will happen. If you defy God in this way, you and your whole line will be cut off. So his line is erased. Whatever happens from Israel from now on, Achan is out. You will have no sons involved in that, no genealogy continuing. And I think that the backwards genealogy points to that as part of the consequence here, is that that's cut off. Now, from the standpoint of the potentially innocent family being killed along with him, we are already dealing with the notion of certainly innocent children throughout Canaan. What do we make of innocents being killed in the midst of all of this judgment?
God is right. That's where I start anytime.
That's right. You start where Abraham is. The Lord will do right. All right, what else?
I think about Jeroboam's son that had just been born, and God said that I saw something good in him, so I'm basically going to take him from you. That was part of the punishment to Jeroboam and his family, was that they would not get to, they would lose their son, but it was also, in a sense, salvation for the son, that he wouldn't be sort of tainted by their wickedness.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So death for that son, in that case, was salvation. For him, while it was judgment on the father. I believe Achan is receiving the judgment here. I believe his family dying is part of that judgment. Everything that belongs to you, up to and including all of your generations, right? It's all being taken. Anyone innocent in that, this is not the ultimate judgment. And I think that's one of the big problems we have in a society like we live in, with a very humanist, materialistic interpretation of life. We think death is the ultimate penalty. It's not even close to the ultimate penalty. Moses did not suffer the ultimate penalty. He suffered a judgment, but Moses did not suffer ultimate judgment. Moses is saved. And the family here, as they submit to this punishment, and I suggest to you, even Achan could be a part of, Achan could submit to this punishment and still receive salvation through confession. Didn't Achan do the very thing that God tells us will bring about salvation? Isn't that what Joshua said? What would be the motive to confess if there's no benefit to confessing? If death is the only thing you could hope for by confessing, then eternal damnation is the only thing you could hope for by confessing, why would you confess? You would just kind of keep up the charade, right? Just keep trying to hide it. I think the confession shows, okay, I'll yield. And yielding even to death is not the worst thing that could happen to Achan. And his family yielding to that is not the worst thing that could happen to his family. And so they may be saying, while a message is sent to Israel, I will brook no dissent. I mean it when I say, do what I tell you to do. Jim?
You see that with David too, right? When he sinned, he confessed and he was forgiven. But God still said, you're still going to deal with this. I cannot let this stand.
Yes.
So you see that repercussion still afterwards.
Yes, absolutely. And so whether it's David or whether it's Moses, you see men who we know are considered righteous in God's eyes and yet suffered consequences, even though they repented, even though they confessed. Brad?
I think your explanation is bolstered by the way Joshua begins. Give glory to God.
Yes. Yeah, and that's the appeal he makes, isn't it? Right? He doesn't say, you rotten. He says, and my son. That's what, Achan, my son. Lay it out here. And that doesn't mean you're going to escape all consequence, but you can at least be reconciled to God before you go and are devoted to God. So anyway, I think there can be a picture there. Now, to add to that, what does Achor mean?
Trouble or affliction.
Trouble or affliction. Now, where else do we see Achor mentioned in Scripture? Two places.
Joshua 15:7, it's used as a boundary marker. And in Isaiah 65:10, it's a place for her to lie down for his people who have sought him. And then Hosea 2:15 is a door of hope.
Yes. All right. So the Isaiah reference and the Hosea are the two I was referring to. Of course, yes, there's the geographical reference there in Joshua. And both in Isaiah 65 and verse 10, as it says there, Sharon will be a pasture land for flocks, and the valley of Achor a resting place for herds for my people who seek me. And then in Hosea, as it says there, Hosea chapter 2 and verse 15. If somebody's got that, go ahead and read it.
I will give her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor as a door of hope. She shall sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt.
All right. Pleasant pastures, door of hope. What does it sound like is being done? I mean, first of all, I do believe both these prophets are referring to that Achor. And so what significance does it have? What are these prophets doing with that?
It's almost redeeming this place.
It's a redemption of a place of judgment, which ultimately is fulfilled in the cross, right? That place of judgment becomes the door of redemption. But what does he do? He goes back to this place. I think in these passages, you see hope. You can look back at Acor, and instead of only seeing judgment, you can see some hope. And I think maybe even hope for Achan, much less the rest of God's people. Did somebody else have any? All right. I think that's about as far as we're going to be able to get. We'll pick up in chapter 8, look at the taking the victory in Ai, and go on into the next lesson on Wednesday. Appreciate everybody's good attention.